What I'd like to do now is to go through Deuteronomy portion by portion, as in a way that is consistent with the different parts of the suzerainty treaty. I won't, of course, be able to go into every verse in great detail, but what I'd like to do is to give you a bit of a flavour of how Moses unpacks this particular covenant with the people, and how he expresses the heart of God through that. And so let's begin in chapter 1, verse 1. As I said, the first five verses are consistent with the preamble, as it's called, in the ancient Near Eastern treaties. This is where the king is identified and who he's making the treaty with. And so you'll notice how in Deuteronomy it begins with, "These are the words of Moses," and it's giving the identification of the place beyond the Jordan. And but I want you to notice how in verse 3 it says, "Just as the Lord had commanded him to speak to them." And it gives a location and it gives a time frame, which is in the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month. That is the 40th year after the Exodus event. And it also speaks about the defeat of two Amorite kings. Now we'll talk a bit more about them in a moment. But what we find is that this law, which is the words of Moses, but he's expressing the heart of God and what God has commanded him to speak, is more than just a cold, clinical law code, because we read at the end of verse 5, Moses undertook to expound this law as follows. So it's more than just a law, it's also Moses speaking to the people, and as I've said, he's expressing his heart to them. So then we move on to the historical prologue. This is chapter 1, verse 6 through the end of chapter 4 to verse 43. In the ancient Near Eastern treaties, this is where the history that led up to this moment is expressed. It talks about the relationship of the suzerain and the issues that had gone on between them and all the events that led up to this moment. And this is exactly what we find here in these portions. And I'm impressed at what is included. When we think of the Israel of history, the history of Israel since Exodus 19 up until this point, there's lots of things that could be mentioned, but the things that are singled out for mention I find very interesting. First of all, I want you to notice how there's a mention that the land has been set before them, just as it was sworn to your ancestor, to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. This is in verse 8. And what he's doing there is reminding Israel of the covenant that God had made with Abraham. In other words, what was about to happen was a fulfillment of the faithfulness of God. Now, you remember that that was a threefold covenant there in Genesis 12, where God promised that he would give Abraham descendants, land, and then through that, through this people, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. In other words, the destiny of the descendants of Abraham was to be that a missionary people in the earth and a blessing to the nations. And what we see is Moses mentioning the fact that this dimension of the land, this part of that covenant, was about to be fulfilled. But then he also talks about how the other element, the fact that the people would grow in numbers to be as the stars in the sky or the sand on the seashore, that has happened too. He talks there about how God had multiplied the people, verse 9, so that today you are as numerous as the stars of heaven. In other words, God has been faithful in his promise to Abraham in that particular dimension. But then, interestingly enough, he talks about the consequence of that, and that was because God had multiplied them, they were too much for him to be that single leader. And we have repeated here the situation that comes, that is spoken about in Exodus 16, where Moses' father-in-law came, and you remember how Moses' father-in-law looked at what was happening and said, Moses, you have to have help. You can't do this on your own. And so there was a restructuring of the leaders. Now what fascinates me is right here at the very beginning of this renewing of the covenant, which is a restatement of the constitution that God was giving Israel. We have two things mentioned. One, righteous leadership, and secondly, justice in the law court system. And I think this is really significant, because if any nation in ancient times or in modern times is to prosper with all of the people benefiting, then these two elements are foundation stones for that situation to happen. That leaders would be righteous and just and have the good of everyone in their hearts, and also that people could go to the law courts and they could actually find justice there, that the judges are impartial. Notice what it says, verse 12. But how can I bear this heavy burden of your disputes all by myself? Verse 13. Choose, that is, you choose. Choose for each of your tribes individuals who are wise, discerning, and reputable to be your leaders. And you answered me, the plan you have proposed is a good one. Now this is really quite remarkable, because what we have here are those elements of a democratic situation where the people themselves are choosing the leaders. And because the people choose the leaders, then the leaders are accountable and held responsible by the people. And then it goes on to say how, verse 16, and I charged your judges at that time, give the members of your community a fair hearing and judge rightly between one person and another, whether citizen or resident alien. You must not be partial in judgment. Hear out the small and great alike. You shall not be intimidated by anyone, for the judgment is the Lord's. If there's any case too hard to you, bring it to me. And so we have here an emphasis that the judges are to be completely impartial. They're not to allow themselves to be bribed. They're not to consider some members of the society less important than other members of the society. Whether they are citizens or foreigners, it doesn't matter. Justice should be across the board the same for everyone. And if there was a difficult case, then there was a court of appeal. That in this early stages was Moses, and later it became the high priest. And so you see right at the very foundations of this constitution these two pillars that are so important for any nation. And Moses reminds them of these things, even as he is talking about the way God has been faithful to the promise he made to Abraham to multiply them. And even as God was faithful to that promise, so he's now going to be faithful to this other part of that covenant, and that is to give them the land that he had promised them. After that introduction, he then takes them back to that moment of failure. And he reminds them how it was that previous generation that when they were ready to go into the land, they had the opportunity, but they failed. And of course this is important because this new generation is in exactly that same situation. And he reminds them of the way the previous generation grumbled. And they twisted the difficulty of their situation onto God and said it was because the Lord hated us. And the Lord brought us out of the land of Egypt so that we would be handed over to the Amorites. And especially their cry was, "The people are strong and taller than we are," verse 28. "The cities are large and fortified up to heaven." We actually saw the offspring of the Anakim. So the Anakim were a tribe or a race of very big people, tall people. We don't quite know how tall, although there is a clue when it speaks about King Og, who had a bed that was 10 feet or 3.3 meters. And of course, such large people would need to build large cities. And when the Jewish people went in to spy out the land, you'll remember for 10 of those spies, their hearts melted when they saw the strength and the size of these people. And so it was particularly this group of the Anakim which seemed to fill them with fear. And so God reminds them of that situation and how God and how Moses had said to them, "Do not have dread or fear of them. The Lord your God is able to go up." But the whole story, as you remember in Numbers, was they failed to go up, and then they decided to go up in presumption, and there was a judgment on them. And so he recounts that situation, but then he does something that I think is really remarkable. Because he says in chapter 2 how they had stayed in the wilderness for many days, and then they had journeyed backwards and forwards, and then the time came, chapter 2 verse 2, where the Lord had said, "You have been in this hill country long enough, now head north." And as they began to move to the promised land, you'll remember in the book of Numbers that they encountered 3 different nations. They encountered the Edomites, they encountered Moab, and they encountered Ammon. Now, the Edomites, as you know, were the descendants of Esau, the brother of Jacob. And the Moabites and the Ammonites, they were descendants of Lot. And so there was a sense in which these peoples were kind of family, even if in a distant way. And I want you to notice that God was very clear, and it's restated here, that they are not to take the land of Esau. And the reason is given in chapter 2, verse 5, "Since I, the Lord, have given Mount Seir," that's this particular area of land to the south of Israel, "I have given Mount Seir to Esau as their possession." In other words, this Esau or Edom, the nation of Edom, had been given this particular land as their inheritance. And then it talks about Moab in verse 9. "Do not harass Moab or engage in battle, for I will not give you any of its land as a possession, since I have given Ar as a possession to the descendants of Lot." And so Moab, they had their possession. And then we keep reading. The same is said for the Ammonites, verse 19. When you approach the frontier of the Ammonites, do not harass them or engage in battle. For I will not give the land of the Ammonites to you as a possession, because I've given them to the descendants of Lot. Now, what is significant about this, I believe, is here we have this people. They were moving into a place so that they could get their inheritance. They could get that land that God was going to give them as their possession. And here in this historical prologue, God is reminding Israel that these three nations, which were distant relatives of Israel, God had done the same for them. He had given them their inheritance. But the situation is even more interesting than that, because in each case it is mentioned that these three nations, to get their inheritance, they had to overcome giants. They had to overcome giants that were similar to the Anakim. So, for example, we read in about Moab, verse 10, the Emim, a large and numerous people as tall as the Anakim, had formerly lived in it. That is in the land of where Moab is. And it goes on to say, like the Anakim, they're usually reckoned as Rephidim, though the Moabites call them Emim. And so, simply put, the Moabites, they had to defeat giants to get the land that God wanted them to possess. And then we come to the Ammonites, and it's the same thing. Verse 20, it is also usually reckoned as a land of Rephaim. The Rephaim formerly lived in it, though the Ammonites called them Zamzummim, a strong and numerous people as tall as the Anakim. And so also the Ammonites, to possess the land that God gave them, they had to defeat giants. And then just to complete it, we read, it was the same, verse 22, for the descendants of Esau, who lived in Seir, by destroying the Horim before them, as they could dispossess them and settle in their place. As for the Avim, who have lived in the settlements in the city of Gaza, and so on and so forth. And it talks about how the Edomites also defeated giants. So I want you to notice how carefully this historical prologue has been put together. Yes, there was a reminder of the failure of the nation before. The reason was because, or one of the main reasons was because of the giants. And now he talks about how when they had finished their wandering in the desert, they headed north, and God explicitly said they should not take these nations. That was not the land God was going to give them to possess, because he had given it to these other peoples. And even in possessing their land, these other peoples had done the very thing that Israel was about to do. And that is to go into the land and defeat giants. And then he reminds them of victories that they have had already on the east of the Jordan. He reminds them that they had defeated King Sihon. He was an Ammonite. We have to make a distinction between the Ammonites and the Amorites. The Ammonites, they were the descendants of Lot, but the Amorites, these were a Canaanite peoples that lived on the east of the Jordan. And there were two city-states. One had King Sihon, and the other King Og. And we have an account here of how both were taken in battle, and they had these victories. And it's in verse 11 that it speaks about the length of the bed, or the sarcophagus, some people think, of the particular king. And the length, of course, gives an idea of his size. And so he reminds them of battles that they've already had victory in. And then lastly, he reminds them that the 2.5 tribes that have decided that they would like to settle on the east of the Jordan, that they are going to be with them as they go across the Jordan to possess the land. And the fact that they are not going to be left alone. And so what we have here is a marvelous presentation as Moses is reminding people in this historical prologue of the journey they've had together. It's not just a message of condemnation that the previous generation failed to enter the land, but rather it is a recognition of the reason why they failed, but a tremendous encouragement. And the encouragement is these other nations were in a similar situation, and they had victory. Also, there had already been battles that had been won. And also, you have the support of your brothers to help you get the victory. And I want to suggest that all of these things can be a help to us when we face challenges as well. There may have been failures in their life. There may have been things that we have tried and it's not gone right. And here we are facing the situation again. And each of these things can be a real encouragement to us. Others who've been in the same situation as us, they have proved God. They have had a victory. And that can be a great encouragement to us. Because if they have had a victory, then so can we. Likewise, there may be battles that we have already fought and victories already had, where we've proved God and been able to break through in areas. And that can be an encouragement for us, that in this new situation we find ourselves in, God is able to be with us, to see us break through as well. And then there's always the support and encouragement of friends around us, those who've already reached their possession, if you like, and they've had victory. They can be with us and support us and help us in our situation as well. And so we see how the historical prologue is so carefully been put together. And then in chapter 4, we have this impassionate plea of Moses that they would be faithful to worship the one true God. And here, in this part of the historical prologue, he does take them back to Sinai. And he reminds them how at Sinai they did not see any graven image. There was no idol. And the fact that there was no idol was really important, because the great temptation would be at this time, with their worldview and all that they have come out of with the involvement of idolatry in Egypt, was to create an image. And God reminds them that they did not see any form. And when God spoke, they heard his voice, but they did not see a form of anything. And therefore, they should be really careful not to guard against, or they should be really careful to guard against, should I say, creating an idol or an image. And it's with these exhortations that he exhorts them to be prepared to receive the actual stipulations of the covenant.